Hey everybody, Paul C. Tumey here. Talk a little bit about my book, Screwball, the cartoonist who made the funnies funny. This is a book that came out about, I guess, about 6 months ago now. Um, it's from the Library of American Comics, uh, put out by IDW, distributed by Penguin Random House, available at bookstores, fine bookstores everywhere. Remember, support your independent bookstore. They need the help right now. And this book is a collection of essays that I wrote and researched, and rare comic strips that I located and found, as well as lots of other interesting, things like photographs, rare photographs you probably haven't seen before, or um, hopefully there's one or two fun things in here for folks who are even extremely well versed in comic strip history. I tried to have something for everybody here on all levels. And for me, this book was a work of about 7 years, and it was just incredible fun to do. And I thought I would try this crazy informal first take uh, video talking about the writing of the chapter in the book on E.C. Segar, L.C. Chrysler Segar, of course, the creator of Popeye and the author of the Thimble Theater strip. Um, I'm really proud of that chapter. I'm proud of every chapter. That chapter was pretty amazing to research. Um, and I wanted to bring something new to the table with each chapter in the book. And Segar, as you well know, has been reprinted quite a lot. And the Fantagraphics folks have reprinted his work 2 times. The complete Popeye Thimble Theater strips by Segar twice. And those are multi-volume printings, and they contain many essays by great comics historians like Bill Blackbeard and Richard Marshall. And so I was, what else can there be said about Segar? Well, as it turns out, I dug around and found some interesting little new connections and facts and tidbits about Segar, and was able to get them into this chapter. Oh, hang on, I should mention this. Let me go grab it because it's right here. This amazing book, put out by Sunday Press, Pete Maresca, Thimble Theater, the pre-Popeye comics of E.C. Segar. This book came out, I guess, about, a year and a half ago. And it reprints selected comics, including a really long run, from the pre-Popeye Sunday Thimble Theater comics, which are great. They're, in some ways just as fun as the Popeye comics. So this is like discovering a whole new chunk of Segar that we didn't even know about. And to my great pleasure, Peter Maresca, the publisher, invited me to write an essay, and it became the introductory essay to this book. Let's see. Loops, Gooks, and Desert Madness, the pre-Popeye life of E.C. Segar. And that introductory biographical essay has some of the same information that you're going to find in my book, Screwball. However, the chapter in this book has more information. For one thing, in the pre-Popeye, everything's backwards here. So wherever that book went, whichever direction it was, in the Sunday Press book, it only goes up to the time that Segar created Popeye. And of course, there's a lot more to the story. So in this chapter, I love that facing image that the book designer Dean Mullaney excerpted and stuck in front of the chapter. So in this chapter on E.C. Segar, it covers birth to death and of Segar, and tells a narrative of his entire life. I had to take a lot out that I originally wanted to put in, and so in this little informal video, I'll see if I can mention a few things that aren't in the book and show you a couple of cool things that for various reasons we weren't able to get into the pages of this chapter that I think you'll find really interesting if you're a Segar and a Popeye fan. Okay, I'm just one of the cool things that we were able to include was a pretty decent sampling of this comic strip called, I don't know if you can read that, Looping the Loop by E.C. Segar. Look how funky and weird these comic strips are. They're, instead of reading side to side, you read them top to bottom, and they're long. A very unusual format. And one of the cool things that I found out from a very rare, heretofore unpublished, actually it hasn't been published in its entirety yet, but an interview with E.C. Segar that was conducted in the early 1930s by a journalist who was writing a book about Arthur Brisbane. As you probably know, Arthur Brisbane was the editor-in-chief of William Randolph Hearst's New York American. I believe it was the American, might have been the Journal, or maybe both. Anyway, he was basically William Randolph Hearst's right-hand man. And he's the guy who wrote all these editorials that Winsor McCay provided his mind-blowing editorial cartoons for. I'll try not to go off on too many tangents. There's so many things I could say about that, but look those up. They're amazing. Richard Marshall put out a book of those and highly recommend it. So in this interview, that, by the way, I should mention was discovered by Michael Tisserand. Uh-oh, got to jump up again. Hang on. Just going to grab this book here off of my shelf. There we go. Okay, this book here is also a fairly recent publication. And this is called Crazy, George Harriman, A Life in Black and White by Michael Tisserand. Tisserand, I'm not sure. I even asked him how to say it, and I can't remember. But this is a really great biography, and it's just an amazing book. And in his research for this book, Michael Tisserand uncovered this treasure trove of interviews, which included an interview by E.C. Segar that he made available to me for the book. What a guy. What a guy. Thank you, Michael. Thank you very, very much. And Segar, let's see if I can find it. Segar talks about how this weird Looping the Loop long strip cartoon came about. And it turns out that he had been working at another newspaper in the early years of his life as a cartoonist, doing the Charlie Chaplin comic strip, some of which is reprinted in this book. And that paper got absorbed by the Hearst paper in Chicago. This is all in Chicago. And Segar was out of a job. And so he was still friends with what was her name? Heck, I can't find it. Anyway, the daughter of the publisher of the paper that he worked for, who was still tied in and had some connections with Hearst. And he sent her letters, as he and his wife were slowly starving to death. He sent her these letters in funny sort of strip-like rolls and like film strips. Here in his own words, in the own words of E.C. Segar, here's the story behind Looping the Loop. Keeley is the publisher of the newspaper that Segar worked for, the Chicago Herald, that went out of business. Keeley's daughter worked in the Sunday room, had a desk right beside me, and when I had gotten married just about 4 months before the paper blew up, she felt very sorry for me because I was out of a job. In fact, I had borrowed $5 from her to get married on. She said, "Write me all and let me know how you get on." She didn't want my wife to starve to death, but a week after I tried to get a job and I couldn't anywhere. So I wrote to Dorothy Keeley. There's her name, Dorothy Keeley. I wrote it on a long piece of paper and mailed it like a roll of film, like a one column. So she took that over to Mr. Author Brisbane, and by golly, it wasn't long when Brisbane wanted to see me. And Segar got a job, and he got this comic strip. And the film connection is really striking to me because in his early years, Segar had worked, as a very young boy in the small town of Chester, Illinois, and his dad, was a kind of a all-purpose handyman and wallpaper hanger, and that's what he wanted his son to sort of follow in his footsteps and work with him. But Segar, being of an artistic bent, got a job at the local opera house and started doing their posters and anything they needed, ticket taker, posters. And the opera house started showing silent films, including silent film comedies by people like Charlie Chaplin. And Segar became a motion picture operator, which in those days meant you hand cranked the movie. There was no motor to run it. So you hand cranked the film projector to show the audience. And in between changing reels, you'd put up a slide on the screen that could advertise local businesses. We still see that today in some of our multiplex theaters. Segar would do cartoons of the locals. And he was so proud of being a motion picture operator that he had tattooed on his forearm the letters MPO for motion picture operator. And I think it's really interesting that the first comic strip Segar fell into doing professionally was Charlie Chaplin's comic capers. So there's a real strong connection and a through line through Segar's life and career of the movies, of films. So his first strip is doing a comic strip, a licensed version of the Charlie Chaplin comic strip. And then the next job he gets is doing Looping the Loop. Now, Looping the Loop refers to the elevated train that looped around the downtown Chicago area. And this comic strip ran in the entertainment section, where all the movie ads would be and all the theater reviews would be. And so it was a bit of entertainment to read and attract people into that page where they mostly had revenue from ads. And Segar would do reviews of the silent films that were coming out at that time in his comic strip. And there's some of them in this book. There you go. I don't know how well you can see this, but this first one right here is a review of a movie called, Eye for Eye. There we go. Never seen it, never heard of it. Eye for Eye, playing at the Rose Theater. So he didn't just do movie reviews. He covered all sorts of interesting local events and whatever else was on his mind. And this was a perfect format for Segar, by the way, because the small panels allowed him to simplify his art style and stop all the busy cross-hatching and, just bits of drawing to fill space and really just focus on cartooning the figures. So he sort of began to streamline his style and tear it back down. And then he began to build it back up again over the next 10 years till we see this incredible, display of cartooning virtuosity in the Popeye years of Temple Theater. So I want to call your attention to one of these strips that I think is pretty funny. This one right here, which is, you know, really hard to see. So I actually am going to try something really oddball here, but I took a phone photo of it, and I'll put this close to the screen, and hopefully you can see that. If I can get the angle just right. Oh man, okay. There. So this is a whole strip about funny noses. And he says, I had to study noses for 40 years in order to draw this cartoon. And he draws all these characters with funny noses. Now, it turns out Segar had a love of drawing funny noses in his comic strips. And when he creates Thimble Theater, he creates a character called Castor Oil, who was Olive Oil's brother. O-Y-L, Castor Oil. And he's a little short guy with a bulbous nose. And then Olive Oil's Castor's sister, and she's long and skinny. And you can see Olive Oil in the Looping the Loop cartoons. You can see Olive Oil, but she's not Olive Oil yet. But you can see that he draws feminine figures like Olive Oil in the cartoons. So there's prototypes for that figure. And Olive Oil's boyfriend is Ham Gravy. And Ham Gravy has a really long proboscis. And you know, Segar loved to tell the story that Ham, when he was a baby, saw a banana and was shocked, and as a result, he has this malady of a very long nose. And Segar just found that to be the funniest darn thing. Here's a picture of Ham Gravy with his long nose, and this is from the very first Thimble Theater comic strip, Sunday. The very first Thimble Theater Sunday. It had been running as a daily for several years before. And you can see that Ham has this long nose. A few other things I wanted to mention about how cool this was. Oh, by the way, those Looping the Loop strips came from the Ohio State University, the Billy Ireland collection. I'm very indebted to them for providing some scans for this chapter and for some of the other chapters in Screwball. So thank you, OSU, and all the fine folks over there. There's so much to tell you. So one cool thing I wanted to mention about Segar's background was I found out that he eventually wound up living in this place on the coast in California called Santa Monica, and that's a beach, sort of a beachfront community. And when he went over there, it was still kind of small, and it was sort of where some of the movie stars had moved out to it wasn't that far from Los Angeles and Hollywood. And you know, so you have people like oh, senior moment, Thelma Todd. There she is, the great Thelma Todd. The lady on the cover of this great DVD, which I highly recommend. This beautiful comedian had a restaurant in Santa Monica, which is where she died, possibly was murdered. Whole nother tangential story there. But you had all these movie stars out in Santa Monica. And also, at the same time Segar was settling down in there, you also had, believe it or not, Milt Gross, who's subject of another chapter in the Screwball book. And Milt Gross went out there to make his first movie, a movie version of his comic strip, Nice Baby. The movie didn't get made, and I'll maybe talk about the stories behind that on another video. Anyway, Santa Monica, man, I was right. So a couple of stories behind this. To write the Segar chapter, I'm going to back up a little bit out of Santa Monica and then we'll jump back in. To write the Segar chapter, I had to really focus. And at the time, it was in the middle of the school year, and my wife and I had two kids in school and everything. And I, you know, I work a corporate day job as a graphic designer, and I needed some time to just focus on this and get the ball rolling. And I really wanted to dive deep into Segar and try to unearth some new information and material about him. And I did. You know, even if it's not necessarily new, it's not very well known or seen. There's a whole lot of photographs I found that we just didn't have space to get into the book. Here's one. This is you know, it's just a picture of a house, but this happens to be the house that Segar was born and raised in. You see, he had a really nice porch there. Anyway, lots of interesting photos and material on Segar's surface. But in order to get this ball rolling, I I took a vacation from work. I took a week off from work, and I rented an apartment on the other side of town. This is in the middle of summer in Seattle, and it was pretty warm. Not as warm as it gets in other parts of the United States and the world, but it was still, you know, shorts, t-shirt, sandals weather. And I was working in this little low rent apartment located in Queen Anne, and just having the best time. Just uh, writing all day with the windows open and a breeze blowing through the window and sunshine, and researching and writing and writing and writing and researching. And I finally started getting stir crazy, and I realized, oh, geez, you know, I really want to make the most of this time and be as productive as I can in this week. And by the way, the Segar chapter took me about 6 months to research and write. But so it didn't all happen in this week, but I did get the ball rolling. Anyway, I was really stir crazy and I wanted to get out of the darn apartment one day, but I still wanted to be productive. So I gave myself the task of going to the big Seattle library downtown and seeing if I could find a photograph of E.C. Segar that had never been reprinted in any of those vast, you know, collections of his work with all those great introductions and all the articles that have been written about him. I wanted to see if I could find a photograph that I hadn't seen before, and by golly, I did. I did. With the help of the reference librarians there, I not only dug up one, but I found three photos of Segar. But one was really, really good. Let me see if I can find it on my cell phone here. So this was from a 1935 issue of a magazine called American Magazine, and this is a photograph of the magazine found in the library, and here it is in the Segar book. I'm sorry, the Screwball book, the Segar chapter. So I'm really proud of this photograph because you're not going to find it in any other book about Segar. And I think it's a very cool photograph. And in the background, you can see just the corner of a large painting on the wall. And I found this amazing news story where this journalist had visited Segar in his home in Santa Monica. And Segar had I guess, had his own home built or maybe modified or something. But anyway, he called his home in Santa Monica, get a load of this, the Segar box. And it was 2 stories. The downstairs floor was given over to the typical rooms of the house, you know, living room and dining room and kitchen and bathrooms and bedrooms. And the upper floor was Segar's studio and what sounds like this incredible man cave. He had a photography studio there. He had a pool table there. Of course, he had his drawing set up. library. Um, he dug a little pond in his backyard, and he would some days lean outside, and he stocked it with fish, and he would lean outside his upstairs window, drop a line down into the pond and fish. This was a guy who loved fun, is how it seemed to me. And I found this newspaper article, like I said, of this journalist who visited Segar, and he describes the house, and it's just, it sounds amazing. And one of the things he describes on the walls was paintings, large paintings of by Segar of his comic strip characters. And in that article, there is a photograph. And I'm going to show you this photograph. And it hasn't been shown or circulated before. And the photograph was just too blurry. You know, it's taken off of a microfilm version of a newspaper. And it probably wasn't very well printed to begin with. And it just wasn't good enough quality to get into our book. We tried, but it just doesn't look good. But here it is, and I'm probably going to publish this in an online article on the Comics Journal someday. And it's probably really hard to see on the cell phone. But that's Segar sitting there, and he's pretending to play, I think, a cello. And behind him, you see this big white square. Let's see if I can get this good enough. That's a big painting of the Sea Hag and Alice the Goon right there. What happened to those paintings? Man, I'd love to know where these paintings wound up, and if they still exist. You know, are they in somebody's home? Are they in a collection, a museum? I don't know. I researched and researched because I would have loved to have put those paintings in this book, but I hope someday they surface. Anyway, back to Santa Monica. I want to show you some pictures of what Santa Monica looked like at that time. This is a color postcard of Santa Monica. You see that it had this big, beautiful beach with a lot of people on the beach, and then a road, and then a gentle sloping hill with houses, neighborhoods, and homes on it. And that's where Segar was. He was about, I looked it up and figured it out, and I can't quite remember, but he was pretty close. His home was pretty close to the water. I figured out he was probably about a 10-minute walk away from the beach. You know, walk down, cross the highway, and you're right at the beach. Oh, and at the beach, they didn't just have the beach. They had something called the Santa Monica Pleasure Pier. Let me see if I can pull up a picture of that. Here we go. Santa Monica Pleasure Pier. So it was this big pier that went out into the water, and it had all kinds of cool stuff, including a roller coaster, a giant roller coaster, which it's really hard to see in this picture, but roller coaster and games, and people, vendors selling cotton candy and hot dogs and hamburgers, hamburger joints, people fishing off the pier, lots of characters on the pier. Probably some of them inspired some of the characters in Segar's comics. And I just had this vision of Segar just really enjoying himself. He loved to fish. And I had this vision of him going out to this pier on hot summer days or nights, perhaps, and just walking around and soaking in the scene and enjoying it. And while I was working on writing this chapter, and for I don't know, a period of about 2 or 3 weeks, part of my mind was back there in 1930 Santa Monica, just really feeling it and absorbing it and really wishing I could be there. It was a hot summer night, and it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I had been writing about Wimpy. And you know Wimpy, if you think of Wimpy, what else do you think of? Hamburgers. I will gladly pay you Tuesday, sir, for a hamburger today. Come on up to the house for a duck dinner. You bring the ducks. You must have me mistaken for one of the Jones boys. Let's you and him fight, and I'll have uh, I'll have a hamburger with pickle, lettuce, and onion both. Those are all, catchphrases from Thimble Theater, and Wimpy was crazy about hamburgers. And there's some stories I can tell you about that too, but God, I've been going on for a long time. And if anybody watches this whole thing, my hat's off to you, sir. Anyway, um, I began to crave a cheeseburger. Now, I'm not strictly a vegetarian, but that's mostly my diet, and I don't eat red meat. And I hadn't had a hamburger in a long time, but damn it, I was really craving a hamburger, writing about Wimpy. And it was 1 o'clock in the morning. I was like, where can I go? And then I remembered in my neighborhood here in Seattle, there was a hamburger stand called Dick's. There's a chain of them around. You should look them up on the internet because their architecture is really cool. It's in the roadside architecture vernacular. And it's like an old car hop drive-in from the 50s. And I went over there to see if they were still open. Turns out they're open till 2 in the morning. I guess they're hitting the after bar crowds. And it was so weird. I'm walking through the dark, quiet streets in the neighborhood, and then I come up to Dick's, and it's like this oasis of light and activity. And lots of people were hanging out there, just really enjoying themselves, eating hamburgers and fresh, salty French fries, hand cut, delicious. Chocolate shakes, cool, creamy, sitting in their cars with their windows down or their convertibles with the tops pulled down. Beautiful clear summer sky with the stars in the sky, and people playing music on their radios and just hanging out, chatting, having a good time. So I got my cheeseburger and my shake and my fries, and I leaned against one of the stainless steel counters that run around the side of Dick's, and people watched for a while, and I just thought about Segar walking on that pier in Santa Monica, and I felt this connection. And the last thing I'll tell you about a story that I found in this book by Bud Segendorf, Popeye, The First 50 Years. This book came out, well, in 1979. And it's a book by Segendorf about working with Segar, and but it also my copy's falling apart. That's a page that's falling out. Let me find a good representative page here. So he has these little short chapters, very refined, very well written, with some art. The second half is about his solo experiences doing the comics, and then finally the comic strip. And he was Segar's assistant. Segar hired Segendorf when he was just a teenager, working in an art supply store. And so, picture this teenage kid working with this nationally famous major cartoonist. And the way Segar would get work out his stories, he spent a lot more time, it's said, and Segendorf says, figuring out the stories than he did actually drawing. The drawings would come pretty quickly, which is amazing because they're really great cartooning. So this section right here, Segar at work, which has this nice photo of Segar at the drawing table. This tells a wonderful story, which I'm going to read to you from. And this is briefly quoted in my chapter. And it's this really vivid story that about the Santa Monica Pier and Segar that I just love. And it just really somehow brings this cartoonist alive for all of us today. Segar was a night worker, and this meant his assistant was too, and that was Bud Segendorf. Our usual hours were from 7 or 8 at night till 4 or 5 in the morning. This was tough on a high school student. It wasn't that I worried about my schoolwork, it was that I didn't have time to pursue my girl. The girl I had chosen to be my wife. Fortunately, Segar was most understanding, and between pages or strips, I was allowed to dash off for a date with the young lady. Few mothers would understand a boy picking up her daughter at 3 in the morning for a fast hamburger. At least once a week, usually on my night off, Segar would call around midnight to tell me it was time to work on ideas. This meant I was to call the pier, have the boat put in the water, gather the fishing gear, and pick him up. Much of the basic creative thinking was done in this boat, tied to what was then the new Santa Monica breakwater. With fish hooks baited and lines in the water, we would settle down to discuss the next week's work. I always had a pad illuminated by a gasoline lantern to make notes. A great part of creating humor is getting into the mood. So true. It's so much about the attitude and the ability to see, to just get that little funny tweak. And it's like a different consciousness. The more outlandish and bizarre the ideas, the better. When the point is reached where you're laughing at anything, you can settle down to the selection of workable segments. During these warm-ups, we'd explode into wild bursts of laughter. People trying to sleep on nearby boats must have thought there was a drunken brawl going on. If they yelled and cursed at us, we never knew it. We were too involved to notice. Of course, when either of us hooked a fish, the laughter would cease. Pulling in a fish is serious business and no time for levity. So I leave you with that wonderful image of the two cartoonists sitting in a rowboat tied off the Santa Monica Pier, fishing and coming up with funny ideas for the next Thimble Theater Popeye comic strip with Olive Oil and Wimpy and all those great characters that they would then go back to the studio and draw and send off to the syndicate. This is Paul Tumey, and this has been a talk about Screwball, the cartoonist who made the funnies funny. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and let me know in the comments below what you think. Should I keep doing this?